You keep thinking about her, don't you? Not casually, not in that passing, oh yeah, she was nice kind of way. I mean the kind that lingers, the kind that shows up when you're tired, when your guard is down. The kind that sneaks in when a song hits just right, or when your phone lights up, and for a split second, you hope it's her. And what's been quietly eating at you is this strange, almost irrational feeling that she has to feel something too. Because it doesn't make sense otherwise. The way she looked at you that one time, the pauses in her voice, the things she said, and more importantly, the things she didn't say. It doesn't feel one-sided, it feels unfinished. And that's the part that's keeping you stuck. Before we go any deeper, if something in you already knows this is about to hit a nerve, stay. Maybe even subscribe, quietly. Not for me. Just so you don't lose this moment when it finally starts making sense. Because what I'm about to say isn't going to comfort you right away, but it might explain everything. You've been telling yourself a story, not consciously. You're not sitting there thinking, let me create a fantasy. No, this is more subtle than that. You've been trying to reconcile two conflicting realities. One, she feels something. Two, she's not here. And your mind hates that contradiction. So it does what human minds are very good at doing. It fills in the gaps. It builds a bridge between those 2 points, even if the bridge isn't entirely real. You tell yourself maybe it's timing. Maybe she's confused. Maybe she's scared. Maybe she's waiting. And some part of you holds on to that. Not because you're weak, but because letting go would mean accepting something much more uncomfortable. And we're not there yet. But we're getting close. Here's what I want you to notice very carefully. You're not just thinking about her. You're thinking about a version of her that exists in your mind. A version that understands you without you needing to explain. A version that feels deeply but quietly. A version that somehow is just out of reach. And the more distance there is in reality, the more powerful that version becomes. Because distance doesn't kill feelings, it distorts them. It turns uncertainty into meaning, silence into mystery, absence into significance. And suddenly, she's not just a person anymore. She becomes a question you can't answer. And questions are addictive. That's why you're here. Not because you're sure she loves you, but because you're not sure she doesn't. And that space in between, that's where this whole thing lives. And I need you to stay with me here, because what you're feeling isn't random. It's not just attraction. It's not just attachment. There's something deeper happening under the surface, something most men never actually stop to examine. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. But it's also the moment things start to change. Because the truth, the real reason there's distance between you and her, it's not what you think it is. Let me say something that might feel almost unfair at first. There's a very real chance that she does feel something for you. Not in the dramatic movie scene where your mind sometimes paints it, but in a quieter, more human way. A flicker, a pull, a moment where she paused a second longer than she needed to. You didn't imagine all of it. And I want to be careful here because this is where most people get lost. Just because something was real doesn't mean it was enough. That's the part your mind resists, because not enough feels vague. It doesn't give you something to fight or fix or prove wrong. It just sits there, uncomfortable, incomplete. So instead, your mind reaches for cleaner explanations. She's confused, she's not ready, she's afraid of how strong this is. But what if the truth is quieter than that? What if she felt something, and at the same time felt something missing? Not wrong, not bad, just not fully landing. And here's where I want you to slow down with me for a second. Because your instinct might be to ask, okay, what was missing? What did I do wrong? That question sounds logical, but it's actually a trap. Because it assumes this was a problem you could have solved if only you'd said the right thing, acted a little differently, shown up in a better way. And that belief keeps you tied to her. It gives you a sense of control, like if you just figure it out, maybe you can rewrite the ending. But attraction doesn't work like a puzzle you solve. It's more like a feeling that either deepens or quietly fades when something essential isn't there. And here's the part most men don't hear often enough. Women don't distance themselves from men they feel deeply safe and emotionally connected to, even if the timing is imperfect, even if life is messy. Distance usually shows up when something inside her doesn't fully settle, and that something is rarely obvious. It's not always about looks, not always about status, not even always about effort. Sometimes it's about how she experiences herself around you. Let that sink in. Not how she experiences you, but how she feels being herself in your presence. Does she feel relaxed or slightly on edge? Does she feel seen or subtly evaluated? Does she feel drawn in or like she has to manage the energy between you? These are quiet signals. Most of them never get spoken out loud, but they shape everything. And if there's even a small misalignment there, attraction hesitates. It doesn't collapse dramatically, it just doesn't move forward. Now here's where it turns inward, because the reason you're still thinking about her isn't just about what she felt, it's about what you felt when you were with her. Something opened in you, something rare. Maybe you felt more present than usual. Maybe you caught yourself caring in a way you don't easily allow. Maybe, for a moment, you weren't guarded. And losing that feeling? That's what's actually hard. Not just losing her, but losing the version of you that showed up around her. So now your mind tries to get it back. By replaying moments, by searching for meaning, by holding on to the idea that there's still something there. But we haven't touched the real reason for the distance yet. Not fully. Because it's not just about her uncertainty, and it's not just about your feelings. It's about a dynamic between the two of you that you haven't fully seen. And once you do, it's going to challenge the story you've been telling yourself this whole time. There's a moment I want you to remember. Not the highlight, not the big emotional scene, but something quieter. Think of the last time you were with her, or even just interacting with her energy. There was probably a point where you felt yourself slightly adjusting. Not dramatically, not fake, just a subtle shift. Maybe you became a bit more careful with your words. Maybe you started watching how she was reacting. Maybe you found yourself thinking, I hope I don't mess this up. That feeling? That's where things start to change. Because attraction doesn't only live in chemistry or connection, it also lives in direction. Who is moving toward whom emotionally, and who is slightly stepping back? And I want to be very clear here, this isn't about blame, not even close. This is about pattern recognition. Because in many situations like this, something interesting happens without either person realizing it. One person starts leaning in emotionally, while the other starts holding the space. And the person holding the space often doesn't even feel like they're pulling away. They feel neutral, calm, observant. But emotionally, they're not fully entering the same depth. And the person leaning in starts to feel it. Not consciously at first. They just feel a kind of friction, like something isn't fully meeting them. And that friction creates anxiety. Not loud anxiety, quiet anxiety. The kind that makes you replay conversations later and think, was that good? Did she feel it too? Why did it feel like she stepped back there? And so you compensate. You try to re-establish connection. You become slightly more thoughtful, slightly more attentive, slightly more intentional. Again, nothing obvious. But energy is sensitive to imbalance. And here's the part that most men misunderstand. When you start reaching for clarity or emotional confirmation too early, it can unintentionally shift the dynamic. Not because wanting clarity is wrong, but because it introduces pressure into something that was supposed to be unfolding naturally, and pressure changes perception. Even subtle pressure. Not because she thinks he is doing too much, but because her system starts to register. This is moving faster than my internal certainty. And when internal certainty lags behind emotional momentum, people don't always move forward. They pause, they observe, they create distance, not to hurt you, but to regulate themselves. And this is where your mind creates its biggest illusion. Because instead of seeing she is regulating her own emotional pace, you interpret it as, something changed, I lost her, I need to fix this. And that interpretation pulls you deeper into the emotional loop. Now here's the uncomfortable truth I need you to sit with for a moment. The distance you're feeling might not be rejection in the way you think it is. It might be misalignment in pacing. Two people experiencing something real, but not at the same internal speed. And when that happens, the slower side doesn't always explain it. They just step back. Not fully gone, not fully present, just in between. And that in-between space? That's where your mind has been living, filling silence with meaning, filling uncertainty with hope, filling distance with story. But we still haven't reached the core reason this dynamic feels so emotionally intense for you. Because there's something she picked up on, something subtle, that you may not have fully noticed in yourself. And it changes everything about how she experiences the connection. I want to be very honest with you here, in a way that might feel a little uncomfortable but also clarifying. Sometimes, what creates distance between two people isn't a lack of feeling, it's a lack of emotional clarity in the moment of connection. Let me explain that in human terms, not theory. There are men who feel deeply, but don't always show it in a way that feels grounded. Not because they're pretending, not because they're hiding, but because something inside them is still processing while they're already in the interaction. So what she experiences is not a steady emotional presence, it's something more unpredictable. Warm, then slightly distant. Engaged, then subtly withdrawn into thought. Open, then suddenly hard to read. And the mind of the person on the receiving end doesn't label that as complexity, it labels it as uncertainty. Now, I'm not saying this is what you are, I'm saying this is often what gets felt in dynamics like the one you're describing. And uncertainty, even when there is attraction, creates hesitation. Because attraction needs a kind of emotional safety to grow. Not perfection, not constant intensity, just a feeling of, I know where I stand with this person emotionally. And when that isn't fully there, something subtle happens. She starts observing more than participating. Not because she wants to, but because her system is trying to understand what it's dealing with. And this is where your story becomes emotionally painful. Because from your side, you're thinking, but I feel so much. Why isn't that enough? And that question is real. But here's the part most people never get told. Feeling something deeply internally is not the same as it being fully legible externally. Someone can sense your emotion, but still not feel anchored by it. And when anchoring doesn't happen, emotional investment slows down, not because the feeling is gone, but because it hasn't settled into something stable. Now let me take you a step deeper into something more personal. There's another layer here that has less to do with her and more to do with what gets activated in you when you care about someone. Because I don't think this is just about her response. I think something in you becomes more intense when there's emotional uncertainty, like your internal world sharpens, focus increases, thoughts loop, and that intensity can feel like love. But sometimes it's actually your nervous system trying to resolve ambiguity, trying to complete the story. And when you can't complete it, your mind keeps her present. Not because she is actively choosing to be there, but because your brain is still trying to find closure in a situation that hasn't given it. This is why silence feels louder than words. This is why distance feels like meaning. And this is why you can't easily let it go, even when nothing is actively happening. Now here's the part that brings everything into focus. From her perspective, she may not be thinking in extremes. She may not be thinking, I love him, or I don't. She may simply be experiencing a mismatch between felt connection and felt certainty. And when those don't align, people don't always move closer. They slow down. They create space. They wait for their internal experience to catch up. But your mind doesn't experience that waiting as neutral. It experiences it as loss. And so you reach for meaning, where there is only pause. But we still haven't touched the most important piece of this entire dynamic. The part that quietly determines whether connection deepens or dissolves into distance without either person fully understanding why. And it has nothing to do with effort. There's a kind of silence in relationships that people rarely talk about. Not the silence of absence, but the silence that happens inside interaction. You can be talking, laughing, even sharing something personal, and still feel a strange gap in the emotional current. No one says it out loud, but both people sense it differently. One person feels like something is unfolding, The other feels like something is still being figured out. And that difference is everything. Because when someone feels like they are still figuring you out, they don't fully surrender into the connection yet. They stay slightly alert, not guarded in a defensive way, but attentive in a scanning way, trying to understand, is this consistent? Is this safe? Is this real in a stable sense, or just real in moments? And here's what makes this so emotionally complicated for you. From your side, you're not thinking in those terms at all. You're thinking in presence, in feeling, in moments, in intensity. And intensity can feel like depth. But for someone receiving it, intensity without stability can sometimes feel like emotional movement that hasn't fully settled. And people don't always know how to explain that feeling. They just respond to it by slowing down, not disappearing, not rejecting, just reducing emotional speed. And when that happens, the person who is more emotionally engaged starts to feel the gap immediately. Because you weren't just enjoying the connection, you were invested in what it could become. And that's where things start to hurt quietly. Now, I want to say something very carefully here, because I don't want you to turn this into self-blame. That would miss the entire point. This isn't about you being too much or not enough. It's about how emotional rhythms between two people either synchronize or don't. And when they don't, both people feel it, but in different languages. One feels caution, the other feels confusion, and confusion is dangerous for the mind, because the mind hates unresolved emotional data. So it starts filling in blanks again, replaying conversations, rereading tone, reinterpreting pauses. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop experiencing her as she is, and start experiencing her as a pattern your mind is trying to solve. That's why she feels so present in your thoughts, even when she's not actively present in your life. Because the interaction didn't fully close emotionally, it stayed open, and open loops are powerful. But here's the deeper truth underneath all of this. The distance you feel is not just about what happened between you two, it's also about what didn't fully land in alignment at the same time. Two emotional systems, not syncing in rhythm. One moving forward internally, one pausing internally. And neither one is wrong for that. But it creates a very specific kind of emotional space. Not connection, not separation, but suspension. And suspension is what keeps people stuck longer than rejection ever does. Because rejection ends a story, suspension keeps it alive. And your mind prefers a living story, even if it hurts, over a finished one that forces acceptance. But we're getting closer now to the core of this. Because there is one final layer, something subtle that often determines why one person starts to fade while still caring, and why the other stays emotionally attached even without clarity. And it has everything to do with what is silently being communicated without words. There's something I need you to hear without rushing past it. People don't only respond to what you say, they respond to what they feel they can predict about you emotionally. And that word, predict, matters more than most men realize. Because attraction doesn't only grow in excitement, it grows in emotional readability. Not predictability in a boring sense, but in a grounding sense. Like, I understand how this person shows up when things are good. I understand how they show up when things are uncertain. I understand what happens emotionally between us over time. When that internal map starts forming in someone's mind, their nervous system relaxes into the connection. They don't have to constantly interpret, they can simply experience. But when that map doesn't fully form, something else happens. They start to stay slightly outside the emotional center of the connection, observing, feeling, but not fully settling in. And from your side, that can feel like distance appearing for no reason. But it's not no reason, it's just not a spoken reason. It's an internal one. Now let me bring this closer to your experience. Think about your emotional presence in moments that mattered with her. Were there times you were fully in it, without hesitation, without self-monitoring, just present? And were there other times where your mind was partially elsewhere, thinking ahead, analyzing, trying to interpret how it was going? Most people don't realize how visible that shift actually is. Not in behavior, but in emotional texture. People can feel when someone is inside the moment versus slightly above it, observing it. And when someone can't fully read that consistency, they don't always pull away dramatically. They just don't move deeper. Because deeper connection requires emotional safety, not perfection, but continuity. And continuity is what builds trust at an emotional level. Now, I want to be careful here again, because I don't want you turning this inward in a way that becomes self-critical. This isn't about you needing to perform better. It's about understanding something more subtle. Connection doesn't only depend on how strongly two people feel. It depends on how consistently that feeling is experienced between them in real time. And when there are small gaps in that consistency, the other person starts to fill those gaps with interpretation. Sometimes those interpretations are positive, sometimes they're uncertain. But over time, uncertainty slows emotional movement. And here's where your situation becomes psychologically intense. Because instead of the connection naturally progressing or naturally ending, it stays emotionally active in your mind without moving forward in reality. That's the trap. Not because she is doing something wrong, not because you are doing something wrong, but because the emotional system between you two never fully stabilized into one direction. And now your mind keeps revisiting it, trying to finish what never reached closure. That's why she feels so present. Not because she is actively choosing to be, but because your nervous system is still holding the unfinished emotional shape of the interaction. And the truth that sits underneath all of this is not dramatic. It's simple. And that simplicity is what makes it hard to accept. Sometimes two people can feel something real and still not develop it into something stable together. Not because love wasn't possible, but because alignment didn't fully settle at the same time. And that mismatch creates exactly what you're experiencing. Emotional presence without physical closeness. Memory without continuation. Feeling without resolution. But there is still one final layer we haven't spoken about, and it's the part that determines why you are still holding on more strongly than you expected, even when logic says you should have already moved past it. Let me bring this all into one quiet place with you now. No rush, no performance, just clarity. There's a reason this connection still sits in your mind the way it does, even when nothing is actively happening anymore. And it isn't because she's secretly waiting, or because something invisible is unfolding in the background. It's something more grounded than that, and more personal to you. What you're holding on to isn't only her. It's the version of you that existed in relation to her. Think about that for a moment. There was a version of you that felt more emotionally awake, more attentive, more open than usual. Maybe even more honest with yourself than you normally allow. That version of you didn't feel ordinary. It felt slightly rare. And now your mind has tied that version of yourself to her presence. So when you think about her, you're not just remembering a person, you're remembering a state of being. And losing access to that state feels like loss, even if the person is not actively in your life. This is where most emotional attachment quietly hides. Not in the other person, but in what we became when we were around them. Now here's the part that might sit with you for a while. The distance you feel, the confusion, the replaying of moments. It's not proof that something unfinished is meant to be completed. It's often proof that something meaningful was experienced without a stable continuation, and your mind is trying to preserve it, trying to keep it alive in thought because it couldn't continue in reality. But there's a difference between preserving something and being emotionally held by it. At some point, the mind needs to stop turning memory into a living conversation, not because it didn't matter, but because it already happened. And I want to say this carefully because I know how easy it is to misinterpret something like this. Letting go doesn't mean denying what you felt. It doesn't mean she meant nothing. It doesn't mean you imagined it. It simply means releasing the idea that uncertainty is a hidden form of connection. Because uncertainty feels powerful, but it isn't clarity. And without clarity, your mind will keep generating meaning where none is being added anymore. Now, about her. Could she have felt something for you? Yes. Could that feeling have been real in its moment? Yes. But feelings that are not nurtured into mutual clarity don't always evolve. Sometimes they just remain as echoes. And echoes are what your mind has been listening to. Not the original voice, but the repetition of it in memory. And here is the final truth I want you to sit with, quietly, without resistance. If someone is meant to move closer in your life in a stable way, you won't need to decode silence for weeks or months to understand it. You won't need to reinterpret distance as hidden meaning. You won't feel like you're constantly assembling clues just to feel emotionally secure. Real connection, when it forms clearly, reduces confusion over time, not increases it. So what's left for you now isn't a puzzle to solve, it's a loop to close. Not by forcing an outcome with her, but by allowing your mind to stop treating uncertainty as unfinished love. Because sometimes the most powerful shift isn't getting someone back, it's realizing you were never supposed to live inside the ambiguity they left behind. And when that clicks, something very quiet changes. Not in her story, in yours. And that's where this finally starts to let you go.